So this week, we've reached a milestone, Naomi. There are no longer six cats on my property.
Oh my god.
There's maybe as many as 10.
Oh my god.
A mother cat, a fairly young looking cat, has taken up residence in my laundry room, which is outdoors. And there's two or three kittens that are running around in the laundry room. And when
Aww.
I come out to do laundry or to refill the cat food that I leave out for the neighborhood cats, I see them just scatter. But the thing I find very funny is there is no maternal instinct to this mom. She doesn't try to put up a fight. She doesn't, try to claw at my eyes. As soon as the door opens, she is running for the hills. She's 50 feet away, abandoning her children to their fates. And the kids, for the most part, get behind the laundry machine. But isn't nature beautiful the way that, certain parents are just like, fuck this, I'm out of here?
Wow. I mean, honestly, I've met a couple moms that are like that, so I'm not surprised that the animal kingdom also has those traits sometimes.
Yeah, friend of the show, RJ, texted our friend group chat this week. What did he say exactly? Sorry, I'm doing that comedy thing where it's like, what else is in the news? Um, RJ goes, a friend of mine just had a kid. He got us banned from a Mexican restaurant a few years ago for puking in the urinal, and now he has a baby. To which friend of the show, Giselle, replied, that seems illegal. And you know what? I don't disagree with her.
Yeah, I think what's extra funny is like when your friends have kids and you realize that one time they like stapled their head. They were like, "What would happen if I just took a stapler to my head?" You know? That seems along the same lines.
You ever see those bug zappers that are like a tennis racket where there's just
Yeah.
like you swat the air with like the electric things? I've had at least two friends who've licked that while it was active.
I think I know which two friends that would be.
Not even I don't even have to say those names. Boy, says a lot about the people I hang out with. Welcome back to my one name guys, a podcast dating, relationships, linguistic screw ups, tongues being tied. We've got it all, ladies and gentlemen.
I am Naomi Guy, and the wonderful man that cannot even pronounce our podcast name after 3 years is my brother, Joel Guy. And we do a podcast called Why Will No One Date These Guys? Because I can actually say it after 3 years.
I'm proud of you, Naomi.
Thank you.
This week, we have a very interesting episode to dig into. Before we do that, though, I have a drink to try. That is T5T, canned tea from Asia. It is Assam melon milk tea. It smells great. I'm a sucker for like Japanese melon, both the flavor and the smell. So I am excited to see what this tastes like. It's pretty tight. I would recommend it. It's got very strong honeydew melon flavor. Maybe very strong. It's not like an overpowering essence. It's like very distinct, but not like overpowering the milkiness and like the teeness. No, it's a good drink. If you see this at your local Asian international market, I would strongly recommend picking up a can. This is quite enjoyable.
Okay. Friend of the show, Joel Guy, recommends this. Just kidding.
Friend of the show, Joel Guy. In that group chat, I did reply when RJ texted that and was like, "Are we certain he didn't just steal the baby?" And I'm
Ooh.
not sure, yeah, if we've ruled that out as an option. Naomi, we are here today to not do a normally planned episode. We are here to discuss what's going on in the news. And not like one of our early episodes where like every week I was rounding up like everything that was going on in the world of dating. This is a very specific thing, similar to Tempe being ranked the ninth horniest city in the country by what was it, like lawnmower.com or something.
Just something stupid like that. Hottubsrighthere.com.
Golden memories. This article came out a couple of weeks back. Unfortunately, we have not been able to get together in a room to discuss this, but I also haven't seen a lot of people at all acknowledge it exists. The only thing I've seen is like news coverage which just repeats the main claims. And
Yeah.
boy, I think there's a problem with that. We will discuss that later in the show. But without further ado, let us discuss that, Naomi. It is the Phoenix New Times article, Study Confirms It Sucks to Be Single in Phoenix, by Jennifer Goldberg, June 11th of 2024. The article opens and says, "How's your dating life?" Is if you live in the Grand Canyon state and your answer is not great, we're not surprised. According to a new study conducted by people search website Spokeo, Arizona is the second worst state for single people in the United States. For people who can't count, there are 50 states in the union, which means we are ranked 49th of all of these states.
49th in education and 49th in dating.
I wonder if there's a relation. And I'll let our listeners just like chew on that for a moment. It's like, who are we behind? Who are we ahead of? Interesting. There's a lot of questions you may be asking yourself. So the study ranks the states based off a number of criteria. Higher percentages of never married adults, people who volunteer, registered voters, and mental health providers were positive factors, while the number of romance crime victims per capita, unemployment rates, number of people who are likely to ghost you, and high cost of living counted against the state. The study assigned the various criteria different degrees of importance. The top three factors were percentage of never married adults, the number of romance crime victims per capita, and mental health providers.
What is
Arizona was a Go ahead.
Sorry, I just have to interrupt. What is defined as a romance crime?
You're way ahead of me, Naomi. We will get
Okay.
to that.
Okay.
In the Spokeo study, Arizona was reported as having the highest number of confidence/romance crime victims per capita, which contributed heavily to its low ranking. The top 10 states for singles in order are Massachusetts, Mississippi, Louisiana, Michigan, South Dakota, Connecticut, Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Kansas. The bottom 10 states in reverse order, so lowest one first: Florida, Arizona, Nevada, West Virginia, Idaho, Texas, Montana, Arkansas, Washington, and Alaska. Naomi, any thoughts on this article?
I would say that it makes sense why some of those populations, some of those states are the worst states to date in. Did you say Alaska was the worst place to date in? You said it so fast.
Naomi, it was Florida. Come on, we just did this like 10 seconds ago.
You said it so fast. You were Okay, Florida doesn't make sense. I would say that Alaska is the worst place to date.
Interesting. What are the factors you're factoring in when you think Alaska being bad for dating?
I would
Besides the
say
fact, and this is a fun fact, Alaska has the highest percentage of law enforcement personnel who were convicted of something like domestic violence or like abuse of suspects and couldn't get hired in the other state. And because Alaska has such a shortage of people, they are willing to hire pretty much anyone. So, Alaska, place to go if you're an abuser. Put that on your bucket list.
kind of like how they sent prisoners to Australia a really long time ago. Anyways, so I would say Alaska just because it's so spread out, and
Mm-hmm.
I think there's like what two main cities, and cities is a strong word, you know. So I would say that is the main reason why I think that, just because you'd have to travel so far to date someone, you know what I mean?
And
Um,
yet, Alaska was 41st in these rankings.
I just I just I just feel like it would be so hard, and also snowstorms, and you'd have and the outhouses. I don't know how that relates to dating, but it does.
I guess
So that's
outhouses not very romantic. Yeah,
yeah, and so that's why I would say that Alaska is the worst state by my definition to date in.
fair. Yeah, so I saw this, and I'm not gonna pretend Arizona is a veritable utopia of dating, as someone who dated in Arizona for many years between 2014 and 2021. Um, it, Something about this rubbed me the wrong way. And so I started looking into the article, and the fact it was like covered so uncritically made me a little concerned, and my suspicions were confirmed pretty quickly when I started looking at like both how the study is structured and then the things they're factoring in and then how they're factoring the things in. It's a complete mess. I feel this is very similar to that Tempe Ninth Horniest City episode we did. This was one of our first 10 episodes. Might have been episode like 7 or 9 or something. But it was done by a website called like lawnmower or lawnstarter.com. It was a website that like provides cleanup services for your yard, but then also did like these crazy surveys like best places to be a nudist, best places to get your rocks off, things like that, provocative things to like bring people in. And in the same way, I feel like this was a study that was created almost entirely to optimize clicks, both from like people who are like, oh, I'm single, I want to know where I should move, but also states being like, we're number 10, or like, we're number 5, or we're number 49. What gives? I hate these guys. Um, it doesn't seem AI generated, so I'll give them that. Like maybe I'm just really bad at telling this stuff apart, but yeah, it's just bad. It's not good. There's a lot of weirdness going on, so let's jump in. So Naomi, here's how they did the study. It's pretty simple. This is not a very complicated approach. So they had a number of different categories, and they ranked these categories in different ways and gave them different weight based off of what they thought was important. So the categories are, and we've already mentioned these, but I'll try to explain them in a little more detail. The percentage of never married people above 15 per state ranking. So this is the first thing that they factored in. This information, according to Spokeo, comes from the most recent American Community Survey data from 2022. We include this data to consider the number of singles in each state. States with a higher number of adults in this category were ranked higher. Any problems with this so far?
I'm wondering why they're including people 15 and up.
Oh, that's interesting. That jumped out at me.
The age of consent is different in every single state?
No, it's how the American Community Survey is structured. I don't know
Okay.
exactly why they've decided to do it, but they like lump together age ranges in different categories, and I think it's like 15 to 25 is one category. So it's not like they chose to do like this data. It's specifically how the survey has been structured, and this has been going on for the better part of like 50 years, 70 years. So like it's been very
Okay.
consistent. It's not the choice of theirs, but you're right. That is a very interesting thing. One
Yeah.
good thing about doing data comparisons is you use the same type of people in every comparison, right? You can't be like this piece of data indicates number of people above 60 who are open to swinger lifestyles, and this piece of data indicates number of singles above 18. We're going to compare these two and then say this is the
Yeah.
best date for like being a rockin' 18-year-old swinger. It just doesn't work like that. But
Yeah.
I think it's a very minor thing. That's not the big thing that I picked up on here. I think it's a good piece of data to start with, and frankly, it might be one of the most important data like points. Period. Right? Because at the end of the day, it's easier to date if there's more single people. Right? That's what
Yeah.
my natural instincts are telling me. If
Yeah.
there's more people out there who are single, that makes it like much easier to date. I'm not saying this is the best piece of data, but it's at least pretty indicative that like certain states with higher percentages or higher numbers of total single people, that's probably better, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Second category is confidence/romance crimes by state. Naomi, what is your inclination of what this indicates?
I would say romance crimes are first date sexual assaults, domestic abuse, um, and first or like murders.
I'm sorry. It's a little more specific than that. It is basically people who are scamming other people over the internet. So, like, I'm a Nigerian prince.
Oh,
I am sending you messages. After a while, you're going to send me $10,000 so we can continue our relationship, and I can wire you, my family's gold doubloons or whatever, right?
yeah.
So they're using data, according to Spokeo. They're taking this data from the IC3. The IC3 is the Internet Crime Complaint Center. I don't know how accurate this is, and maybe that's its own criticism. But basically, it's the total number of people who've reported crime victims, and then they divide that by 100,000 to come up with like the number per 100,000. And they do this for a number of stats. It's actually quite clever. I thought initially they might not have bothered to do this, but what they're trying to do is standardize this data across states of different populations, right? Because if you have like 10 cases in South Dakota and 5 cases in Arizona, South Dakota is going to be worse because the population of South Dakota is so much smaller than Arizona's, right? Um, yeah, sorry, that math tracks. But yeah, so it's important to standardize, and by using this like 100,000 a number, I don't know why it's not higher, I don't know why it's not lower, but like that's the one they came up with, and they do appear to be pretty consistent with that. I don't know. What do you think about using this as a metric? Number of romance crimes.
I mean, I think it's hard just because I think that a lot of romance crimes, the way you're describing it, happen over state lines. And so it's like
Hmm.
long distance, because like ghosting and not ghosting, but catfishing, I feel
Mm-hmm.
like that happens, if it's over state lines, it's long distance relationships, or like same with the what you were talking about, like the Nigerian prince, like that could be, anywhere in the world that's happening if you're emailing with this person, you know what I mean? So I think that that's the big issue that I have with that data point.
I mean, I have two issues with this. The first one is like, you look at the data, there's not a huge difference between the states. Like there is a difference between the states, but it's not like so noticeable that if this like impacted you, you would be like horribly affected by it.
Yeah.
The second thing is a lot of these romance scams go unreported. I looked around. I found a stat from cybersafe.com talking about romance scams, and it claims that if you're a security professional, you should be very worried about these types of scams because just over half, approximately 55% of romance scams are actually reported to law enforcement. So
Mm.
there's a decent number of these that aren't getting reported. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that states with an older population that's less comfortable with technology probably are more hesitant to report being scammed just because they're so embarrassed. It's like, yeah, a hot 18-year-old was contacting me and I fell for it. It seems like that's something that should be factored in, but I get it. The data is not going to be perfect. This is what they're drawing from. We'll get to weighting in a moment, but like, how important do you think this should be in the grand scheme of like weighting factors for uh, how important it is to be single in a state, how easy it is to be a single in a state?
I don't think it should be a factor in this, because I don't feel like if it's going unreported, you know what I mean? Like it doesn't make any sense.
That's an interesting point. We will return to that. The third factor, Naomi, is the number of mental health providers per capita, per state per capita. So they refer to the county health rankings and roadmaps, most recent data on the number of mental health providers in each state. Similar to crime victims, we also calculated mental health providers per 100,000 residents. We included this data since recent dating trends suggest that emotional intelligence, self improvement, and general openness to discussing mental health and going to therapy are all important criteria for modern singles. What do we think?
I understand the importance of mental health in dating. I understand that. But I don't think that this should be a factor, because every single state is dealing with a lack of mental health providers right now. It's not just like there might be, a slight, like a slim margin of of a larger number of providers in one state, but I don't think that this should be a factor when it comes to dating, because not everyone has like believes in therapy, not everyone has access to therapy. Like therapy is expensive, and not a lot of people have time for like it in this economy, really. I don't think this should be a metric.
So I appreciate this survey looking at all age ranges for singles, right? You could imagine like some other surveys might be like, oh, only people between like the ages of 18 and 40, because those are the hot, sexy singles that we care about. But no, it's everyone who's 15 and up, and that includes people in their 60s and their 70s and their 80s and whatnot. The problem with doing that is that not every age range goes to therapy at equal rates, and not every age range values going to therapy at equal rates. So they're using this incredibly broad section of the population, right? 15 and up. We're talking hundreds of millions of people in the United States alone, not even accounting for people worldwide who might have similar opinions. But then they're using these things, these like litmus tests for dating that are only important, I think, for a lot of the younger population. According to BetterHelp, 11.6% of those between the ages of 18 and 44, as of 2021, completed therapy or counseling. So about 12% of 18 to 44-year-olds, 9% of people 45 to 64, and just 5.7% of people 65 and older. So double the number of people between the ages of 18 and 44 have attended therapy or counseling compared to people 65 and older. So there's the
Well,
problem of mixing all this
there's
data in a big pot.
so many factors that go into that. I understand why you don't want to mix that. But at the same time, I feel like even including 15-year-olds, 15 to 18-year-olds in that is an issue,
Mm-hmm.
because the
Fair.
vast majority of like 15 to 18-year-olds only go to therapy unless their parents want them to, or it's court mandated, or you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of different reasons why people go to therapy. There's not many people that can just go to their parents and say, "Oh, I want to like start therapy," and it happens. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I don't think that that's a fair age either to compare it to.
Yeah. So again, like there's going to be a lot of methodological problems with this study just based off how they've compared data sets. I think that's kind of an intuitive argument, but we're going to get even more granular with how they've done each of these categories once we get through summarizing them. The fourth one is unemployment rate per state. They referred to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics' most recent data on state unemployment rates. We included this data to consider the state's livability and the likelihood of making a living. Research suggests that modern singles are protective of their money and debt, and financial issues can pose problems for relationships. So states with higher unemployment are ranked lower. What do we
Hmm.
think?
That makes sense. You're not as likely to go on a date. You're not as likely to want to go on a date if you can't afford, going out to dinner and things. And I don't know if this is the same for. I don't know. I don't know. I think that that's a good way of measuring things, but at the same time, 15-year-olds can't be employed so I'm confused why they're included in the study.
Well, you might consider. I hadn't even thought about this before you brought that up. People over the age of 65 are going to be more likely to be retired and thus
Yeah,
unemployed.
another good
So
point.
there might be states that are very old that have a lot of single old people who are looking to date that are considered lower in this ranking because those single old people who, look, it's America, no one has financial security, but have a little more financial security than other populations might be, ready to get down and clown, as the old people say.
Yeah, that's what they say.
That's what they say, Naomi. We've always had our finger on the pulse of AARP magazine. I'm excited that our listeners can finally, see this side of us. I agree with you. I don't think this is a horrible metric. I think that there's definitely problems, but I find it interesting that they included this because of the next one. And the next one is cost of living. They referred to the most recent cost of living data from the Missouri Economic Research and Information Center. They wanted to consider the area's livability and the ongoing rise in the cost of living. So states with high cost of living were ranked lower. And I'm like, this feels like a lot better of a metric than the last one for the reasons we just outlined. It makes intuitive sense to me that if the cost of living of an area is lower, it might be easier to go out and date. Not saying that's a perfect one to one comparison, but it definitely seems a little more applicable than unemployment. What do you think?
I don't think that that's a major factor in dating though. Like I live in one, I think it's the most expensive city in the country right now, and I don't think that that has caused a decline in dating or a decline in sexual relations.
That's fair. I mean, maybe I'm thinking about this all wrong. I did, want to just comment on this that I think it's probably fair to say your success in dating may be based on whether you can afford an apartment or take out a lot of people on dates. But also, I would say that states with lower costs of living, like Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Kansas, probably also have lower wages, right?
Mm,
So, like, just because the cost of living is lower, the likelihood seems higher to me that you may not have as much disposable income to go out and date, just because
yeah.
you might be making $40,000 a year living in Oklahoma, and that's an okay salary in Oklahoma. But at the end of the day, it still might not be enough in order to, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I don't even need to say dating anymore. We understand implicitly. That's what I'm
Yeah.
referencing. States most likely to ghost you. We refer to survey data from a recent Forbes health survey that found the states where you're most likely to be ghosted. We include this data to consider the possibility of getting ghosted since it's especially prevalent for younger Americans. States with a high score were ranked lower. I don't hate this. I mean, I think ghosting kind of sucks, but like if you compare it to like number of women who are like murdered when they go out on dates with people, doesn't seem like the most important thing. But look, if we're talking about all the aspects of being a single, okay, we can throw this in the pot. What do you think?
I want to know where you're most likely to get ghosted.
We can discuss that. We'll get back to that in a few.
I don't know. This is hard because a lot of people have different understandings of what ghosting is, and a lot of people don't have that like
Hmm.
emotional intelligence enough to realize like, oh, I said something that could be perceived as um harmful or dangerous, or like you just mentioned, like this.
Yeah.
Like, I think that a lot of people that I've met that say, "Oh, I've been ghosted," I'm not saying they deserve it, but at the same time, it's like, okay, what did you make this person feel unsafe? Did you make a passing comment? Did you know what I mean? It's kind of like hard for me to justify this as a good way to like a good metric on this survey because
Hmm.
it's just hard to understand. You know what I mean? It's hard to understand why you're being ghosted, and it's hard to understand exactly if people are being ghosted.
Sure. There's just two more categories, Naomi. We won't touch on these too much right now. That is formal volunteers per state per capita and number of registered voters per state per capita. In terms of volunteers, they say a recent study found that not caring about politics was a dating red flag, and we included this data since recent dating trends suggest that modern singles are looking for those who are more tuned and involved with social causes and politics. For registered voters, they said we included this data because recent dating trends also suggest that modern singles are looking for those who are more attuned and involved with social causes and politics. A recent study also found that not caring about politics was a dating red flag for men and women. So those are the 8 categories. Any thoughts on those last two before we jump into data analysis?
I don't think that volunteering and registering to like registered voters should have been separate category, but that's fine. Just me.
Yeah, yeah. They struggled to find, I think, the data to support
They
this
really
study.
sat down and they said, "What are the categories that we can put into this data set?" and just pulled it out of their poop.
I think that is a component here. I'm reminded, there's this axiom that sometimes simpler is better when it comes to like formulas, because you can come up with like incredibly specific formulas and incredibly specific programs that can be beaten with, much easier rules at far higher accuracy. I recall one anecdote from the corners of the internet where someone, described they were a programmer who entered a programming competition their, I think, freshman year of college, and this was a comp science program, and the idea was to code the best possible poker player bot that you could. And so, based off of the moves that other players did, you'd have to make moves and you'd have to win as much money as you could in simulated rounds of poker. And they wrote like 3 lines of code, and the basic code was like, when round starts, go all in. And that's the only thing their program did. When round starts, put all your money in the pot. And apparently, this simple line of code, these simple 3 lines of code, was enough to win the competition because every other program had been planned around these, ideas that people would have certain strategies, that if certain people do this, that indicates they're actually thinking this, et cetera, et cetera. And when someone just breaks all the rules and does something like no other player would do, that breaks it. And in the same way, I'm kind of like, it feels like the only metric that really is meaningful here is the number of singles. Like, I'm not saying that's even the best one, but that feels just in general like a really helpful metric, and everything else is kind of tangential to it. But
Yeah.
that's why, Naomi, research and statistics has invented the concept of weighting. You're familiar with weighting, right?
Yes.
Okay. So it's good that that's not what they did with the study, saying, oh, all of these 8 categories are exactly the same importance. We're going to take all of them, put together the rankings, and come up with one final ranking by averaging them. Not what they did. They did weighting. And weighting is when you factor in a number of different variables to your study and then assign them respective importance. And you multiply their values or divide their values by that respective importance in order to allow certain factors to influence it a lot more than others. So let's go back through this list. How did they weight this? Well, for the first category, it was the percent of never married adults above 15 in the state. The total percentage of this for the whole study was 20%. So 20% of the final score for each state is going to be based off of this first piece of data. That's pretty high. That's not terrible.
Yeah.
The second one is going to be confidence/romantic crime victims per state per capita. They gave that 15%. They said that was nearly just as high as the previous category, which seems a little suspect to me. Third one is mental health providers per state per capita. That's also 15%. That seems a little high. Unemployment rate per state, 15%. Cost of living annual average, 15%. States most likely to ghost you, 10%. Formal volunteers per state per capita, 5%. And registered voters per state per capita, 5%. Those last couple, yeah, I mean, I guess you can throw them in and keep the weighting super low. I don't even know if I would have given them 5%, but the end formula gets you 100% and allows you to compare all these states to one another. So I sent you a spreadsheet, Naomi, where I copied all of their information and I looked at the weighting. And the most important thing to understand, if you're looking at the study from the outside and you're like, well, just tell us, guys, is Arizona the best state to date or not? It all depends on the weighting, right? The weighting is a very subjective part of this. And depending on how much importance you assign to these different categories, it completely changes the rankings. For some, not a huge amount, but like the middle section between like the number 5 on the list and number 45 on the list, huge amount of variation there, depending on how much weight you want to give things. So we can play around with this. If we go by their initial weighting, what we come up with is, sorry, the way they've initially structured it is Massachusetts is going to be in first. That's column L, Naomi. The weighting comes up with a score of 15.45 if we do it their way.
So that's the best state to date in.
Yes. The next
Okay.
one is Mississippi with 16.15, then Louisiana with 18.65, and we go all the way down, and we get Arizona with 34.5 and Florida with 34.9. We just barely beat them.
I just Nevada, Texas. I'm looking at the state ranking right now, and I'm kind of confused, like really confused.
So, but then I started playing around and I was like, well, what happens if you increase the percentage of importance that income is? Because I'm like, I can see income playing a pretty important role in people's lives. So if I filter by that, suddenly Mississippi, not Massachusetts, is the one in first. Massachusetts is in second. South Dakota is in third, followed by Michigan, Iowa, Louisiana, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma. All these Midwest states suddenly gain a lot more prominence when that takes weight. If we weight that by 30%, we get Mississippi still in first, followed by South Dakota, Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Michigan. We scroll down to the bottom of the list, and suddenly Arizona is the very last with a score of 42.22. Ahead of it are Nevada, West Virginia, Florida, Texas, New Jersey.
And California, yeah, California is in the bottom 10, but it's like 41st. It's not, I'm surprised it's not lower.
Yeah, there's some weird stuff that happens. Really, no matter what you do to play with these variables, as long as you give income like a disproportionate share, which I kind of think it should have, what you get is that Mississippi and some of the like what you might refer to as flyover states gain a lot of prominence, and that's interesting because that's kind of counterintuitive. Where if you're using these specific variables, states that are very rural for the most part, that have pretty spread out populations that are potentially difficult to access, somehow gain prominence over other states. I mean, you could really do whatever you want with this. You can come up with ways to make Arizona at least the top 25. There are ways of achieving that I've done. But the point I wanted to illustrate here was that these states can move quite considerably based off of how much importance you give any of these scores. And I would argue I can't come up with like an objective assessment. Honestly, this is going to depend heavily on like people's personal preferences. I don't think there's an objective way of saying, this is ideally, what singles want for every single person. But it should make you immediately skeptical where they have a bunch of quote unquote objective criteria that are themselves kind of subjectively chosen as important and then given subjectively important scores and rankings and weightings that then affect the final score. Like, this is by no means an objective study. This is like a very biased study. I'm not saying they try to get a certain result, but like they set it up in such a way that like it looks bad for certain states and gets people talking. So that's like strike one for this, as if everything you've heard before wasn't already bad enough.
Yeah, I'm with you on this. I'm with you on the sense that like the importance of the cost of living should be more. It and because that is a huge factor in dating. And I think that like everything, just talking to a lot of different people about dating and what they find most successful, like a lot of people, if you're, let's just go with generically, a lot of people meet on dating apps these days. And if someone, if let's go with Bumble for an example. If a woman reaches, no, let's go with Hinge. If a man asks right away, "Oh, let's go hang out tonight," or something to get to know each other. Let's just like not even text, let's just hang out together, which a lot of women don't like, but let's just say that goes through. The woman is not going to want to go to the guy's place on a first date. And if that's all they can afford, like, you know what I mean? Like that's hard to get past because it's like you want to meet. Women don't want to meet at your house the first time. Women don't want to take that chance that they could be murdered or, sexually assaulted on the first time they're meeting someone. So it's hard to get past that. And I think that that should play, so the cost of living and the and income should play a larger role in this, in these data points.
And I would almost argue these are bad stats because we're not really talking about how expensive stuff is. We're talking about how much discretionary income people have left over,
Yeah.
right? And that's like a very different thing.
I would also like to include in this data set like the amount of inflation per state. I think that that would be an important aspect because I know that the only reason why San Diego is ranked the worst place to live right now because of because of cost of living is because of inflation. So I think that that should be an added data point in this because that would I think give a fuller picture of everything that's going on.
Yeah, I think you point out something important, which is that they've selected 8 things that appear to be based off of easily accessible data sets, and they've ignored some probably more important factors that should be included. I came up with a couple, maybe you can think of some others, but here's just off the top of my head what I could think of. First one would be states with the highest number of amenities, places like parks, amusement parks, coffee bars, bowling alleys, bars, restaurants, libraries, arboretums, skeet shooting clubs, axe throwing, etc.,
Third
right?
places.
Sure. No, I think that's a good measure. I don't know if that data exists, but that seems like a very important metric because the more places you have to go meet people, the greater the variety of people you can meet, the more fun you can have, the more dates you can go on, etc., etc. Again, not saying that's going to be uniquely the most important thing, but it feels like an important thing for singles trying to get out there and meet people. One thing that I think a lot of people care about, states with lowest rates of STIs. Arizona, unfortunately, kind of high in those rankings there, but that feels like something that's important to people. Maybe they don't think about it all the time, but if you bring it up, people are like, oh, yeah, that is something I care about. Why not look at the number of people on dating apps in each state? Right? The number of singles is an important factor, but like just because you're single doesn't mean you're putting yourself out there. It seems better to focus on the number of people who are actively trying to date. Again, not saying that's the only factor because you can meet people even if you're not planning on dating and fall in love with them, but it seems like it should take some prominence. Average connections on dating apps in each state. I do know that like the number of connections in different states varies quite considerably. That feels like important information for people trying to get out there. Or then a factor like why not the number of marriages in the state in prior years or marriages per capita. I'm not saying that like every single person wants to get married, but many people want long-term connections, and I feel that's indicative of are the people meeting in this state comfortable enough to want to spend their entire lives together, right? And so, not saying give it a huge amount of weight, but at least factor that in. And those are all like pretty obvious things to me that they could have included. Not saying all that data is easy to find, but if you could incorporate that data, this would be a much stronger argument. And outside of the STI thing, I think Arizona does pretty well in a lot of those categories. So anyone who's like listening to this is like, they haven't talked about Arizona. Where does Arizona actually stand? Should factor that in, right? Just because they didn't include the data doesn't mean that data isn't meaningful for a lot of people.
I would include two others. I agree with what you said, but I would also include number of people using birth control. Again, not something easily
Mm.
accessed. And also access to abortion or abortion clinics in the area.
Mm.
I think that both of those are important because obviously, like, if dating and sexual relations are obviously very interlocked, but if you are just casually dating someone and you're obviously going to want to be on birth control and things like that, like
Not necessarily, but I see your point.
they also don't necessarily define dating in this. Like they say dating as, they aren't saying like, okay, how many people are actively, going out? Like, are they saying that in the sense of like relationship or long-term partner, or like what are they talking about when they say like what is the measure for dating in this?
I'm going to answer that question, but we have to segue slightly.
Okay, go ahead.
So you've heard from me, from us, a couple of bits of information, dear listener, about why this study is flawed. But we haven't even discussed the accuracy of the data they're using, really. And
Ooh.
I decided to drill down a bit into that, and what I found doesn't look particularly good. So let's go back to this first category: percentage of never married adults above 15 in each state. So the first thing I guess I'd have to say here is like it's interesting that they're doing percentages. I get that a higher percentage means that there's greater chances of success of like just randomly approaching people, but I don't really think that's how single people see it. I'd rather know that there are a million possible people available to me than 50% of the population. But the reason they're doing this percentage thing is because they didn't want this entire thing to be skewed by state population, right? Because bigger states most likely are going to have bigger percentages, bigger numbers of single people. And so, in order to keep it kind of fair for all these smaller states, they had to, change it into a percentage. That said, I don't know if percentage is necessarily the best thing for a single person. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, so in answer to your question, I have a question for you, Naomi. What does never married mean to you? That's how the American Community Survey defines this population: percentage of never married adults above 15 in each state.
That could mean anything. That could mean people in long-term relationships. That could mean people that have live-in partners or and like never they're engaged for long periods of time. Like I have a friend who her parents have been engaged for 20 plus years and they still haven't gotten
Mm-hmm.
married. That just like to me that means anything up to the point of legally being married by the state.
Yeah,
That doesn't include long-term partners. You know what I mean?
well, I agree with you. I think this stat in particular actually does include that. Anybody who's never been married, would be, as you described, kind of fall into that category. Here's my concern, Naomi. Are there people who've been married who are no longer married?
Yeah, divorced people, people that have had their partners die.
They're divorced people or widows who are single and looking for partners.
Single and ready to mingle.
Down to clown.
Stop it. It's not a thing.
Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yes,
Never
I see
married
where you're coming
doesn't
from.
include the millions of older people who have either been divorced, been widowed, or for other reasons separated from their partner and are interested in getting back on the dating market. So the data they're using is not reflective of the population of the United States. But strangely enough, the American Community Survey has a whole section of data that deals with exactly this problem. The American Community Survey asks whether a person is currently married, widowed, divorced, separated, or never married. For some reason, this study hasn't factored in the widowed, divorced, and separated people. All they have to do is take the never married categories and add those other three categories in, and they get the number they actually want. But they didn't dig deep enough into the data to do that. They grabbed the first metric they could find because they didn't want to add together the data sets or they didn't understand the data. And when you factor that in, you get a really interesting answer. So, American Community Survey provides this data. In 2022, the year the data is from, 37% of men over the age of 15 had never been married. But Naomi, 48.4% of US men over the age of 15 were unmarried. That is, single. So they're saying, let's compare all this data, and when you factor it in, you get a pretty significant swing to the populations of the United States. What about for women? In 2022, 31% 31.1% of women had never been married, and 50% of women were unmarried or single. So you've just
That's,
added in
yeah.
millions of people to every single state. And that's completely going to flip the scores, especially because 20% of the total score is based off this single metric. So small deviations to the score there could lead to pretty large swings in the rankings. Let me give you some examples of how this changes things. New York is number one when you factor this information in. So New York has 16 million people, 16,400,000 if you care. 45.4% are estimated unmarried. 38.7% are estimated never married, meaning that 6.342 million New Yorkers were never married. So the difference in New York is between 38.7%, about 39%, compared to 45.4%. 5% extra of the population gets added to New York. Pretty significant jump. North Dakota and Washington in the original rankings are both tied at 26 because both are at 32.7% never married. But when you factor in the data, Washington pulls out ahead because it is 49.7% of people unmarried, and North Dakota only has 48.2% of people unmarried. Wyoming is ranked number 50 initially in the data, 27.7% estimated never married. But when you factor in unmarried people, i.e., divorced people, people who are separated, people who are otherwise single, you get 47.6. 20% of the population gets added to the score of that state when you factor in the data properly. Huge swings. I would encourage people to download the data from Spokeo and play around with it yourself, because when you factor this stuff in, everything gets flip-flop turned upside down. Now, all of these states have higher single populations than New York percentage-wise. Keep in mind, I told you that New York State has 45.4% estimated unmarried and was initially ranked as number one. But North Dakota, Washington, and Wyoming, three states we would not consider as being a particularly good place to date, have higher percentages than New York. And so that completely changes the rankings if we go by their methodology, kind of proving how busted it is. You with me so far?
Yeah, I honestly am just trying to figure out like who would be first in this if we actually used the good data instead of the data that they were giving us.
I think I haven't gone back and checked. It's going to be Washington State. 49.7% of people there are unmarried. And what's interesting is, yeah, there's a pretty big difference.
So you're saying Washington State would be the best place to date people?
I'm saying, in terms of that factor, Washington would
Yes.
be
And it's
better.
tied at 26 right now, which is kind of crazy.
Yes. I mean, actually, if
Okay.
you look at the
Okay.
rankings, if you look at the total rankings, Washington is number 42. And a big part of that is because they're number 26 in the rankings of number of single people. But you can imagine if they're suddenly at number one, that's going to
Yeah.
bring them significantly up the charts.
Okay. Okay. Wow.
Yeah. So again, I don't have an exact answer for people because depending on how you want to weight this stuff, it can dramatically change the answer. But this should tell you not only is the data they're using flawed, they don't seem to understand that it's flawed, and the fact it's flawed is going to change these rankings pretty considerably. But let's go back to romance crime victims per capita, Naomi. You remember that one?
Yes, I do. And again, I don't think they have the actual data for this. So I'm gonna be surprised that you pull things if you pull things out of this.
So let's look at census numbers for the population. So they ranked South Dakota as number one in the United States in this specific ranking with 25 cases of romance crime. Let's ignore the fact that 50% of the total cases aren't reported. Are you with me so far?
Yeah.
So South Dakota is a great place to date because it has so few cases of romance crime. There's 25 cases reported in the year that they pulled this data. There are 910,000 people in the state, so that comes out to 2.74 crimes per 100,000 people. Okay,
Yes.
so if you go out on dates with 100,000 people, Naomi, only three of them are going to rob you, or only three of them are going to catfish you. That's pretty good.
That all report.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Nebraska, middle of the pack, is 25. It has 45 total cases of romance crimes with 1.97 million people. So that's 2.28 crimes per 100,000 people. You see anything
Yeah.
weird about that?
Okay, again, this issue is that like if 50% of the people are not reporting the crime, you're going to have different statistics in every single state. So let's just
Yeah,
say
no, no, you're missing the forest for the trees, Naomi. I agree with you, but let's read this again. South Dakota is the best place in the nation for dating because it only has 2.74 crimes per 100,000.
yes,
Middle of the pack is Nebraska, which has 2.28 crimes per 100,000. Naomi, is 2.28 higher or lower than
it's
2.74?
lower. So you're talking about number of people in the state.
Uh-huh. But that's how
Okay.
they said they got the data. And when I do the math, it comes out and it looks like their math is wrong. What's number 50, Naomi? Number 50 in this ranking is the beautiful state of Arizona. Arizona is number 50 with 213 cases, 7.36 million people. That's 2.89 crimes per 100,000. In fairness, that is lower than both South Dakota and Nebraska, but it's not that much, right? Like we're talking like 1 in 25,000 to 1 in 30,000 cases. That doesn't feel that likely in the grand scheme of things. Maybe their math is wrong in certain places, but like even if their math's generally correct, there's not much of a distinction of the total number of romance crimes. I think that that's a big problem, especially given how much weight and importance they've given this. If there's just not much of a distinction between states, why include the stat at all? You're just as likely to get robbed as in South Dakota as you are in Phoenix. There's not a reason to include this and give it any sort of prominence.
That's fair. Yeah.
Okay, so the math thing kind of threw me, and I tried to dig into that. I was like, wait, maybe it doesn't make sense to use total population. So maybe it only makes sense to use 15-year-olds and above people because babies probably aren't falling victims to crimes. Like I was checking their numbers with census data, and census data includes babies. Most babies aren't, getting scammed by Nigerian scammers online. I don't know. YouTube's gotten weird, so maybe that's
So
changed.
true.
But for the
So true.
most part, it could be that they're doing their math properly. So then I looked at the American Community Survey and tried to find the information about the number of people above the age of 15 in each of these states, and I recalculated it. So we're going to take the number of romance crimes divided by the number of people above the age of 15 and try to figure out, that number per 100,000 again. So South Dakota has 887,000 people who are above the age of 15. They have 2.82 scams per 100,000 people over the age of 15 who have never been married, approximately 1 in 33,000 people. Nebraska has 1.9, about 2 million people, and so they have 2.28 crimes per 100,000 people. It's the same as before, where Nebraska actually has lower crimes than South Dakota, but is ranked much lower than them. I don't know what's going on there, but approximately 1 in 50,000 people is going to fall victim to a romance crime in that state. And then Arizona has 7,151,000 people, so 2.98 scams per 100,000 people. Again, approximately 1 in 33,000 people. So again, if you recalculate it in a way that makes sense with their other data, Nebraska, which is in the middle of the pack, is still actually the best state. I didn't do this for all of them, but you can see that there's something wrong with how they're calculating things. But even if you assume that they have a different way of calculating that's accurate, the variance in romance crimes for people above the age of 15 is not that much. It's 1 in 25,000 to 1 in 33,000. That's kind of negligible in the grand scheme of things. I'm not saying that like being conned by someone, being catfished by someone doesn't suck, but it doesn't seem like it should be as prominent as it is in their score. And if you take this out, I don't think the final scores would actually be impacted that much. This seems very weird. My
Yeah.
takeaway here is basically that they suck. Their research is terrible. They're doing something wrong. They miscalculated something. They compared a wrong table somewhere, and they didn't bother to double check their work.
No, I agree with what you're saying, but now like I said last time, like all I want to do is re-rank these properly and see what like state actually is number one and which one's number 50.
Maybe we should do a follow-up episode where we just play with these variables until Arizona every single time shows up on top. Like no matter what data we put in, Arizona is the best state in the nation. See, I told you.
I love
Yeah,
how we say that even though both of us are not single in Arizona anymore.
it's true. Yeah. I no longer fall into the never married category of the
Yep,
American Community
there you
Service.
go.
So, Naomi, let's go back to mental health professionals. Mental health professionals, the metric was, sorry, mental health providers per state per capita. And this was given a 15% weighting. So if you look at their list, Massachusetts is first, Illinois is 25th, and Alabama is 50th. So first ranking, middle ranking, last ranking. Massachusetts has 51,000 providers, so there's one mental health provider per 140 people. That's pretty high.
Okay.
Second one is Illinois. It has 39,570 providers, so it has one mental health provider per 320 people. That's lower. I get it. I can imagine Massachusetts would rank higher in this. And then finally, Alabama has 6,680 mental health providers, a 1 in 740 ratio. So that's quite a bit lower than Massachusetts.
So here's my perspective on this, and I haven't looked. Maybe I should look at the actual data set for this, but um, I'm looking at 50th is Alabama. What's 40th? And here is I'm like trying to look at the bottom half and see where exactly in the continental US they are. Okay, Alaska's 45th. Maryland, because I was thinking, okay, if it's in Alabama and let's just say the last 10 were in the Bible Belt area, like in the South, it makes sense because it's like, okay, it's more an emphasis on like praying the mental health away, you know what I mean? Or the mental health, praying the anxiety away, praying the depression away. But the data does not prove that. So I'm going to get rid of that theory.
I mean, I don't think I'm not saying that hypothesis is right, but I can sort of see where you're coming from, where there might be certain areas of the country where like they don't think mental health is that important, and that's true of all singles, where they're kind of less like, like we can go to church, we can rely on our
Yeah.
community institutions to make us feel better. I do want to point out, though, that if you look at the numbers, the metric they're looking at appears to almost be a poverty metric. Rural South states have lower access to all forms of health care, and most people prioritize physical over mental health, even if they can afford treatment. So, this is like just an easy way for the study to say poorer states are less desirable places to date without them being seen as classist.
I would agree with that.
But even then, you can imagine that people who want mental health support may rely on like friends and family to get mental health support compared to, disproportionately compared to other states around the union. So Naomi, mental health care providers, as we've shown, clearly there's a difference state to state of what percentage have access to mental health providers, the ratio of mental health providers to normal people. My question for you is, if you go to therapy, does that mean you improve? Because Spokeo said it was important to
Yeah.
use these tests because singles value mental health improvement. Just because you go to therapy, does that mean you magically become a better person?
No, and I would say that the vast majority of people that actually need therapy and are self-aware to realize that they do need therapy aren't in therapy or like are in therapy, and the people that don't like think that they don't need it aren't in therapy.
I guess my second problem is, and I don't want to be a dick here, but like people with mental health issues and poor emotional intelligence still deserve love. Like, I'm not saying all of them do, but like there's a decent number of people who, again, due to poverty, just don't have access to these services. And just because they're not going to therapy or just because the therapy isn't available to them doesn't mean they aren't a decent partner, they couldn't be a decent person, or that they don't deserve, someone in their life. And so, like, maybe some daters want to see these things in a partner, but I don't think someone not going to therapy is automatically a disqualification for a lot of singles. It's like being over 6 feet tall as a man. Like, many women might want to see that, at least in theory, but they're not necessarily going to pass up, like, a 5'10 short king like myself just because they want the 6 foot thing. Like, yes, a lot of people would prefer someone who's maybe going to therapy, but it's not necessarily going to be a deal breaker. I can't imagine a lot of situations where like going to therapy or not going to therapy is the thing that makes someone decide they want to continue with that other person long term.
Yeah.
We good with therapy?
Yeah, go ahead.
Um, you did make a reference to the ghosting stat. I mean, I'm basically okay with the unemployment rate and the cost of living. I've raised some concerns about that already, but the ghosting stat stood out to me. So that was the states that were most likely to ghost you based off of a Forbes.com health article. You know Forbes, Naomi, that wonderful peer reviewed mental health institution.
Oh yeah, of course.
Mm-hmm. So I looked at this article, and the article was looking at only US adults who have dated in the last 5 years. It was not looking at all singles. It was not looking at people who had experienced, ghosting, but like had no longer stopped or no longer dating. It's like a very limited representative sample. It's not,
Yeah.
applicable to everyone over the age of 15 in the United States. I'm going to assume some people in their 60s who have long since settled down also experienced ghosting back in their day. I'm not saying like it was more common than now. I assume, virtual dating has made it a lot more easy to date people. Just because you're meeting more people, it becomes
Yeah.
easier to ghost more people. But like it's not like it's a new phenomenon, and the fact they've only, interviewed people who've been dating the last 5 years is probably a bad thing. Um, I also think it's interesting because the data is a little weird. It's looking not at whether respondents were ghosted, it was looking at whether they were ghosted or had ghosted people. It's mixing those two together.
Okay.
So maybe it's that the people of that state suck more if the ghosting rate is high, not necessarily that like there's a greater problem of ghosting if like that number can be relied upon in a meaningful way. There's also some really weird data if you look at it, where somehow only 27% of the people of Oregon say that they've been ghosted or have ghosted somebody. 27% of the people who are dating, Naomi. The next lowest state is Hawaii with 48%. And then most of the states are at like 90% of respondents saying that they've been ghosted. So somehow Oregon is like heaven if you never want to be ghosted. And I have no idea how they came up with that number. I can't think of anything about the dating scene of Oregon that would apply to me it would have such a smaller number. That just feels like a problem with the data.
Here's my other issue with this is that if Forbes is using data that's 18 and over instead of 15 and over, why are we
Mm-hmm.
using that as a data point? Because
Fair
that's not
point.
inclusive.
Agreed. And I would argue that a lot of young people who don't have like proper communication skills yet are probably more likely to ghost somebody.
Yeah.
Food for thought.
27%. That doesn't make much sense. Okay, whatever. Move on.
The other thing I was thinking about while we were going through this is I'm like, well, ghosting's important, but why aren't we looking at states with the highest unsolved murders or states with like
Yeah,
the highest numbers of like domestic partner violence? Those
yeah,
feel like numbers you can find, and those matter a bit more to people than say whether or not someone's hurt their feelings by ghosting them.
yeah,
States with low levels of domestic partner violence might be better for singles just because there's less fear that they'll be in a relationship with an abuser, right? That seems more tangibly tied to people's interests.
yeah.
Okay, last two, Naomi. The last two were formal volunteers per state per capita and registered voters per state per capita. And boy, do I have some issues. In fairness, these don't have the highest weighting. Each of them is only 5% of the total score. But it's just baffling to me why they included them. And I see all sorts of problems with how they've decided to structure this. Can you think of any problems why using volunteerism might be a bad way to measure whether a state is good for singles?
Utah. I would say I would this is my general inclination that in Utah there is a high number of volunteers because that is a big thing when it comes to religion, and Utah is a religious state. I would say that is an issue for me. I would also say, what do they consider volunteering? Because it could be that they are saying there's high volunteer rates in some places because it's state mandated volunteer hours. And so if there's a higher crime rate in that state, like what are
That's
you
interesting
saying that
point.
volunteering is? And so that would be an issue. And then but I just why is this on this list? Because I think that some people are like, oh, happier people volunteer, but at the same time, it's like that's not always true. Some people are just like needing court ordered to. So that's
Well,
my
remember, it's the line they used twice, both in this section and the last one. We included this data since recent dating suggests that modern singles are looking for those who are more attuned and involved with social causes and politics.
I don't feel like if you volunteer, you're more attuned. I think that like the vast majority of people would love to date someone that's been to a protest recently, and the vast
Mhm.
majority of people will not tell you that they've been to a protest recently.
Yeah, to that point, like I don't really think there's a link between willingness to volunteer in politics. Like when I volunteered at the library or when I volunteered at a food pantry, I met a lot of people who are like super conservative who have no interest in dating, right? I can imagine there's a lot of people, have reprehensible political views who still feel the desire to like volunteer at their church or something.
Nuns, they would be a perfect statistic for this specific study.
Okay, so regarding what you're talking about in terms of formal volunteering, so this is based off U.S. Census data. I guess they do a supplemental thing where they try to take a representative sample from around the United States and ask, hey, do you do volunteering in either a formal or informal way? And so formal is like, do you volunteer with an actual organization? Informal would be like, do you, pick up trash on the side of the road? Do you like help your neighbors, mow their lawn once in a while, right? Do you go and I'm struggling to think. There's like a lot of
Soup
unstructured ways
kitchen.
you can help your
Oh,
community. Yeah.
yeah,
It wouldn't be a soup kitchen. That would be formal volunteering. So you
yeah,
volunteer with an organization. It would be like, pretty much, cleaning up trash, making sure your neighborhood's safe, helping your neighbors, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess my first problem is it kind of feels like a litmus test for wealth because it's easier to volunteer when you don't have to work one and a half, two, or even three jobs, right?
yeah,
It seems very closely related to whether or not you have like enough
yeah.
income from your primary job and or if you're retired.
Yes, that's what I was gonna say, is that I feel like the older you are in age, the more likely you are to volunteer because a lot of people like need something else to do during their day other than work.
Yeah. The other thing is like they're only including formal volunteers who volunteered with like official organizations. And my problem with that is there's a lot more people who informally volunteer than those who formally volunteer, and I would argue that like you should include both of those. So the census actually did an article on this in 2023 titled "At the Height of Pandemic, More Than Half of People over age 16 and over helped neighbors and 23% formally volunteered." So 50% of people informally volunteered, 23% formally volunteered. That's a huge swing in the total population of these states.
Yeah,
And again, the difference is like, did you volunteer with a church group? A lot of young women might have a problem dating someone, who's very closely connected with their like church group,
yeah,
compared to did you help your neighbors by giving them food or toilet paper when the grocery stores were empty and they couldn't access those? I would personally prefer to date the person who gave their neighbors toilet paper, right?
yeah.
That's meaningful, Naomi.
It is. You really got to wipe your
Wiping their
butt, and
butt is an intimate act.
if it's double ply, man, I'm gonna marry that man.
Yeah, but you can imagine, someone who cleans up trash in their neighborhood seems like someone who's like probably a more committed person than like someone who like cleans the altars of their local church. Or, and you could imagine this, someone who's volunteering as part of a formal organization screaming at people getting abortions every single week, right?
Yeah,
There's lots of reprehensible volunteering stuff. And then there's a lot of volunteering that's like, I don't know if that actually helps the world and like engages in social issues in a way I find meaningful.
yeah.
Like I'm not trying to crap on churches. I'm just saying like
No,
there's a
I think you
difference
should.
between again mopping, the break room at your church and like giving food to the hungry, and
Yeah,
this is kind of wrapped up in the same box if you use this simple stat. I would also argue, and this is not necessarily based off data, but I think I can make the case for it, that states with high levels of informal volunteering, such as Montana, Nebraska, Maine, and Delaware, might also have higher levels of single people who are fine being single because they don't
yeah,
need to chain themselves to someone to survive. They have a community. Unfortunately, a decent number of people in society kind of have to be in relationships because society is so expensive right now. And in
yeah,
states with higher levels of informal volunteering, you may feel less of a pressing need to date because your neighbors might be able to spot you $20 to cover your electric bill, or that they can watch your kids for an afternoon as you go do a doctor's appointment. And so I don't know if like states with high levels of informal or formal volunteering necessarily are states that there are more people down and ready to clown. It might just be that there are states where the people are happy spending time with their community. Not claiming that I, can see into the world out there and make this with any definitive proof. But that seems like something that seems intuitive to me. Final section, Naomi. Registered voters per state per capita. They looked at the most recent U.S. Census Bureau data from the total number of registered voters. They did this because they said that a recent study found that not caring about politics was a dating red flag for men and women. Thus, they used the states with the highest number of registered voters. What do you think about this data?
I have an issue with it. One, because of felony rates and like drug related felonies.
Good.
So that could be like combined with if the state has legalized marijuana use or other drugs. Um, my other thought is 15-year-olds can't vote. My
Oh,
other thought is that it doesn't necessarily, like, I understand the wanting to be involved, but I don't think a lot of people, even registered voters, don't vote.
oh, that's an interesting point, Naomi. Yeah, a lot of registered voters do not vote. Um, so only 66.8% of registered voters voted in America in November 2020 during the last presidential election that many refer to as the most important presidential election of our lives. So 30% of registered voters did not vote in that election. Um, Now, if you look into the specific ethnic data, 68.3% of white voters voted, 62.6% of black voters voted. These are registered voters, 59.7% of Asian voters, and 53.7% of Hispanic voters. So, my question is, if voting is actually important, why not use the percentage of people who actually voted in each state? And I think it was because it was difficult for them to find this data. I did also look at their data set from census.gov, and I think that once again, Spokeo has beefed it because there are 12 states with higher voter registration rates than Rhode Island, which they've ranked as number one. There are 17 states with higher percentages of people who actually voted in the November 22 elections. They also appear to have used data from the midterm elections, not 2020, like I was just referencing, which makes no sense because midterms almost always have lower turnout. Like, yes, it was the most recent election, but it's also not a meaningful thing because even like politically active people often are like, it's the midterms. Like, it's not the end of the world if I decide to skip this.
Yeah.
So their data once again appears to be wrong. But to your point, like there's plenty of reasons that people don't vote. There are places like the rural South where millions of people are effectively held captive by gerrymandered counties, and no matter how high the turnout is, they've almost no chance of taking back state houses. Some people aren't registered to vote because no matter who they vote for, their lives won't change. Some people aren't registered, to your point, because they're a minority who was thrown in prison due to racism in their state, and now they legally can't vote. Some people aren't registered because voter registration is deliberately difficult. So using this as a litmus test for whether or not people are politically involved is probably not a very good one, right? There appears to be more accurate data out there. It appears the data they're using, they've either misinterpreted or like somehow processed wrong. Honestly, I think the most important metric, at least for young people, would be something like, have you been to a protest in the last year? Have you participated in like social advocacy?
I'm sorry, have you allegedly been to a protest in the last year?
That's a good point, Naomi. These anonymous surveys aren't so anonymous. The census is processing all this information for the NSA. I shouldn't say that. I'm not spreading this information. So, another completely garbage stat that they're throwing in where the data is botched, the relevance seems a little crazy. And all of this has me wondering, why did Spokeo put this horrible, horrible study together? Naomi, do you recall what Spokeo does?
No.
Spokeo is a people search website. And if you scroll to the bottom of this study, it has a little blurb advertising their services. It says finding your next brush with love may be easier to come by in one of the best states for singles in the United States. However, safety should be a top priority regardless of where you're dating. A few quick searches may be all you need to protect yourself from romance scammers and dishonest serial swipers. Use Spokeo's people search engine to look up your next date to know what you're getting into before taking things too far. So Spokeo puts out this garbage study that they threw together in an afternoon. They did it to get people talking about the best places to date. Once people are thinking about, oh, is my state actually a good place to date? Then they draw you in and are like, well, if you're concerned about the people you're matching with, we have a way of background checking them. And thus they're able to make more money.
Okay.
But my concern here is that this is kind of a microcosm of the state of US media, because a company made a verifiable claim about a phenomenon with a profit driven motive using sloppy data sets, and then media regurgitated this information with no critical analysis when 10 seconds of thinking would have yielded obvious criticisms. Unfortunately, every article I have seen on this from a variety of publications, both in Arizona and nationally, has reported this as though it is gospel, as if there is no bias to the decisions that they made, the data that they're using, the quality of their data, etc., etc. It is frustrating to be in the world today and see all of these people who are given a ready-made piece, plug it into their news app, and hit publish.
I really want to see a study that like rates the top 50 sexiest cities in the US and see what data points they use for that.
That would be good. I'm thinking one where, like, you know how there's like all those banner ads on sketchy websites that are like, "Do you want hot milfs in your area?" I think they should do a study on like the places with the best hot single ladies looking for sex, right? Like tell me where those banner ads are actually going to be the most effective.
That's a really good
Alaska.
question. I saw actually a billboard with Danny DeVito on it, and it made me want to go to Jersey Mike's. So maybe Danny DeVito should be.
We saw those on our way to Los Angeles last week. That man is a fossil. He's perfectly preserved.
Oh my god!
Fossil's the wrong word. He is a pickled egg of a
Ew.
human being.
Are those any good? I've never had one.
Jersey's Mike's is forgettable. I
No,
mean,
I'm
look,
talking
some
about pickled
people.
eggs. I'm talking about pickled eggs.
Oh, I don't know. They seem like they might be slippery and not in a good way.
Ew.
80 closing thoughts, Naomi, besides Danny DeVito looking like a pickled egg.
I think you poked enough holes in it for me to be like, yeah, this is a shitty data set. So I think we're good.
Singles, rest assured, wherever you are, you can make it look like the best place for singles
Yeah.
as long as you play with the data enough.
Yeah.
Are we done yet?
Yes, we're
Feels
done.
like we're done. Okay, well, from us at Date These Guys, I guess the takeaway here is be insanely skeptical of claims about the state of the world of romance or dating. Someone probably has a bridge or a people search engine to sell you. And if you remember nothing else from this episode, is that Danny DeVito, like pickled eggs, are a national treasure. We need to keep him around forever. If the technology for cloning hasn't advanced by the time he approaches death, we will have failed as a species.
Don't date like my brother. No, you're supposed to say it. Don't date like mine.
My
I
brother.
really honestly shouldn't say that though because you got yourself a bad bitch, so I can't really say anything about that.
Yeah, how embarrassing. Keep up with me now. Don't date like my sister. And then you should say, don't date like me. Now we're done.